Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to a little section called Birds of Passage. I mean, think about already in our study of Leaves of Grass how many times birds and flight have been referenced, and how many times passage or evolution or growth has been mentioned. And so it won't shock us when we are messing around with a cluster of some 7 poems. Now, these 7 poems will be the Song of the Universal, 1876, Pioneers, O Pioneers, 1865, To You, Whoever You Are, 1856, France, the 18th year of These Are States, of These States, 1860, Myself and Mine, 1860, Year of Meteors, 1859 to 1860, and then and that one is 1865, and with antecedents, 1860s, initially published under various titles between 1856 and 1876, and appeared in different clusters, annexes, supplements, companion volumes, into their final, can we say, nesting place in Birds of Passage. Now, our assumption is that you've been with us at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, we call our playlist Talks with Walt, and we've been messing around from the very beginning. Now, there's a set of assumptions that I always like to share as we began a new section of Leaves of Grass. Remember, we point out a number of times, and I think Leaves of Grass proves this so well, that we are the stories that we tell and retell. We're, of course, the stories we decide to accept or reject. And so we're paying attention all the time to our learning theory, that idea that we're always looking to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. We always say it, the new is the new, the NEW is the KNEW, and there's always connections that we're trying to draw. Now, our annotative approach will, of course, ask 3 guiding questions. What does the text say? That is to say, summary. What does the text mean? Here we're looking at 2A, themes and messages. At 2B, rhetoric, not what Whitman says, but how Whitman says it. And finally, ask the third and guiding question that's really the most important is, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3A, how can I relate to other texts, and especially, of course, previous texts in Leaves of Grass? As we are coming now soon to the midpoint of Leaves of Grass. I mean, when you kind of hold the volume up, we're there. We, of course, have finished with what we have called the Psalms section, the Song section. If we're talking about, as Whitman called it, Leaves of Grass being the New American Bible, although obviously one of the final songs, Song of the Universal, is the first of the poems from this section. And then finally, most importantly, we'll ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way personally myself? Now, we always talk about our big 5, as we have spoken about it many times in room 303. That is to say, about any text, we always ask, what does this text say about 5 major important things? First of all, of course, epistemology and what we can know. And that's always going to be an important discussion in a Whitman poem. And then from there we go to ontology, and that is to say who we are. Is the question of being. Like, obviously you're a body, but what else are you? Well, I'm a mind, possibly a spirit or a soul, and Whitman's going to play that game with us. And our big 5, 3 and 4 will be always interconnected. Psychology, the study of the individual minds, fears, motivations, and the like. Sociology, the study of the group. And these will dance back and forth in Leaves of Grass. We've seen this many times already. And then finally, of course, and we're going to see this obviously in our study of these 7 poems, the question of theodicy. That is to say, why does bad things have to happen? And as we've pointed out so many times, Whitman, we're not going to call him a blind optimist. We're going to call him an informed optimist. I mean, he's acutely aware of the terrible things that have happened in the history of the world, obviously the history of America. We think of the American Civil War as just one classic example of that. But we're always looking to no longer ask, why did this happen to me, but rather, why did this happen for me? So that idea of the theodicy for Whitman, we're going to see that in these poems as well. And then finally, we have said that when we look at Leaves of Grass and Whitman, we're not talking about one Whitman, but at least 5 Whitmans, although obviously there are a whole bunch more than that. And we call these the 5 Ps, or 5 perspectives on Whitman. Whitman as person, he obviously has a biography, and occasionally we dip into that to talk about that. Whitman as poet, no question. He wanted to be considered, after he was so influenced by Emerson's classic little essay on the poet. He wanted to be America's poet, so we're going to have to talk about that. I think that the 3rd P is crucial, especially in these poems. Whitman is pedagogue, or instructor, or teacher. He started out as a teacher. I think he remained so tied to education and to teaching. Whitman as politician, and especially his celebration of democracy. We're definitely going to see that in this set of poems. And then finally, Whitman as philosopher, from Socrates to Emerson and everybody in between. He's very influenced. Now again, our best approach here, the recommended approach, is you have your own copy of Leaves of Grass, the Deathbed Edition, and you are reading on your own, and then you come to our lectures to kind of supplement what you have already decided you think you understand about these poems. Now, as we always do at the beginning, especially of a group of poems, we did this with our last one, now we're going to do it again. Let's go to our Nortons to hear what Nortons has to say about this Birds of Passage section. This group, he says, new to Walt Whitman's final 1881 arrangement, appears under a title which admirably suggests an abiding element in his poetry, the sense of flight and change. So I would write that one down already, guys. That's kind of some of where we're headed with each of these poems. Although the 7 component poems each appeared in a different group in various earlier editions of Leaves of Grass, they now acquire a casual unity of tone because each deals with movement. So write that down, that's going to be central. Whether of the evolution of cultural perfection, or westward expansion, or the search for one's identity, or the vicissitudes of history, end quote. So as we begin this process now with a little bit of background information about all 7 of these poems, we're going to maybe think there's an organizing principle. Some have argued that there is some kind of cyclical movement. Migrations of birds, of course, come to mind. Obviously, we're going to be messing around with flight, as we just read, movement, change, evolution. There is a sense, Hadley Moser, a scholar of Whitman, has pointed out, there is a progression or an evolution as possibly really central here. Cosmic evolution from imperfection to perfection, cultural evolution, the shift of civilizations from east to west, and we can talk about America itself from east to west. And then, of course, there's going to be that evolution of the personal from, maybe we would argue, self-deprecation to self-affirmation, as we've seen so many times in Leaves of Grass. There's lots and lots of different kinds of migrations, both physical and non-physical, that we'll point out here. Obviously, time and history, for example, and the migrations there. And then let's point this out, only one poem in this set of 7, the Song of the Universal, that we're going to turn to next, incorporates explicit bird imagery, but we're going to see all kinds of ideas of flight and the possibility of birds there. And obviously, we're going to be talking about the idea of progress in these poems and how we think about progress. Birds obviously have already been mentioned a number of times in Leaves of Grass, and we're going to come to this idea of the passage. Think about Passage to India as a poem that we're going to be studying later, so the use of this word passage will excite us as well. Now we're going to turn, as our very first poem, to the last of these songs, Song of the Universal. And you will find that we, in the Deathbed Edition of Leaves of Grass, we will have come a long ways from Song of Myself to Song of the Universal, and yet there seems to be so much of the echoes as we've been referencing it over and over again. So I welcome you back to LearnStrong.net for a series of these 7 poems, Birds of Passage. It'll be a lot of fun. Thank you.